right, this set of notes will be on 5.3, the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is all about basically the modern agricultural revolution, where we are focused on increasing the yield of our crops in order to supply enough food for our exponentially growing populations. And so this is a common goal of societies throughout the world, just improving the agricultural methods. And so let's go ahead and talk about sort of when this all started. So, this shift in agriculture away from the small family operated farms occurred, and we moved to a model where we had large industrial scale, really like mega farms or agribusinesses. And so, this happened to when we really saw this exponential growth in the 20th century. So, in the 1900s, we had an increased use of mechanization. So, we're using a lot more machines to do the work for us so that we can produce food on a much more massive level. This not only involved mechanization, but it involved something called a GMO, or a genetically modified organism, or a genetically modified crop, a GM crop. It also involves increased use of irrigation, of fertilizers, and of pesticides. So we're going to talk about each of these and what impacts those had on agriculture. It also, the Green Revolution, greatly increased the efficiency of our land and the short-term profitability. Not necessarily the long-term, because there's a lot of unintended consequences that came along with this short-term profitability, and it also greatly increased our food supply. So the good news is that it actually decreased world hunger, and it increased our Earth's carrying capacity so that we had more resources to provide for our exponential growth of humans. So the negative consequences that came along with this included soil erosion, biodiversity loss, ground and surface water contamination. And so we'll talk about each of these things. So mechanization is the increased use of different machinery involved in the plowing of land, the tilling of fields, and harvesting by using combines. So this increased yield and an increased crop yield means more money for the farmers as well, so increased profits. The issues with this includes an increased reliance on the combustion of fossil fuels. And anytime that we combusting fossil fuels equals increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which then in turn increases climate change. And so that's going to be a common theme that we talk about throughout the rest of APES. Heavy machinery also compacts soil, decreasing the water holding capacity of soil, and it makes the topsoil more prone to erosion. We're actually going to do a lab on that, so we'll be talking about that in more detail later. We also have, because of the Green Revolution, a high yield variety of crops. So we ended up being able to have increased hybrid crops and increased genetically modified crops. Both of these types of crops produce a higher yield. And so what that means is that the amount of crop that we receive is going to be higher per unit area than in the past. I don't think it's so important that you understand the difference between hybrid and genetically modified crops. Just understand that there are these different types of crops that increased yield. This increased yield actually provided food stability in areas that there was not food stability previously. So in areas like India, for example, Pakistan, and Mexico. And then GMO crops, or GMOs, are crops that have new genes, really even genes from like different organisms. So they might have a gene from a fish that is now going to be inserted into like a tomato plant. And so that's kind of the difference between hybrid crops and GMO crops. I'm going to get rid of my picture here just to kind of show you this. If you'd like to look at this, it explains it in a little more detail. But just understanding that that's the basics of what these two things are important. Okay. So a GMO is a genetically modified crop that has genes to improve either their drought tolerance, their pest resistance, to give us faster growth so that we get them quicker, or maybe we can grow multiple rounds of the crop in one growing season, or we're looking for like a larger fruit or more grain from the actual plant. So those are all things that we're looking for because these factors will increase the profitability, because we'll have fewer plants that die from disease or from drought or from pest, and we'll get more yield per acre, which is super important. And so here you can see we have corn that was genetically modified to avoid pest. Obviously, this ear of corn on the bottom is not saleable, like you can't actually sell that to anybody. I wouldn't buy that, but I would definitely buy the one above that's more pest resistant. Okay, one of the first most famous examples of a genetically modified organism was something that we call BT corn, because it has a gene from soil bacteria that produces a protein that actually kills insects that like to feed on corn. So one issue with GM crops is that they're all genetically identical, so there's little genetic diversity, which means they're more susceptible to disturbances from either diseases or pests. Okay, the next type of green, next factor for, I can't think really quickly, my brain just stopped working. I apologize for that. Another sort of piece of the green revolution is synthetic fertilizers. And so this is the shift from organic fertilizer like manure, animal waste, and then also compost, which is biomass, decomposing biomass, to synthetic fertilizers that are man-made fertilizers made out of chemicals like ammonium, nitrate, and phosphate. And so this increases the yields and the profits because we're putting the more key nutrients that are needed for plant growth, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, added directly to the soil. It's added to the soil to improve the growth of the plant. And so an issue with this is that we have excess nitrates and phosphates that will now run off the fields and into nearby waters where they create eutrophic environments. And so if you remember, that's where algal blooms grow, lots of excess algae grows, and it eventually will kill off the other organisms that live in the waterway. And then the other issue with synthetic fertilizer is that in order to produce synthetic fertilizer, it requires fossil fuels. And so using these fossil fuels actually releases CO2 into the environment, which then adds to climate change. All right, irrigation. Irrigation is another piece of the agriculture revolution or the green revolution. This is where we get water from the ground or nearby surface waters, and we distribute those to fields, which obviously if we're adding water to the plants, they're gonna grow better. And so this makes it possible to grow crops in parts of the world that are normally too dry for crops. One kind of famous example of that is the ability for us to plant in the western United States, especially in areas like Arizona, Mexico, Southern California, areas that would normally be too hot and dry to grow crops. We now can irrigate and grow crops. The problem is that this ends up depleting our groundwater sources like aquifers, or even the Colorado River is a kind of famous example of where we're using too much water really it's tragedy of the commons, like we talked about in 5.1. And so the other issue with this is that we're overwatering, and that can drown the roots because the roots end up not getting enough oxygen from the soil. And this also, irrigation can cause soil salinization. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about irrigation, but it increases the salt level in the soil, which is not, it's actually toxic for plants to have too much salt in the soil. Pesticides are another piece of the green revolution. And so this increases the use of these synthetic chemicals that we spray on crops to either kill weeds or insects or rodents or other pests. Again, this increases the yield and the profits because we have fewer plants that are lost to pest. But then one major issue is that these chemicals can actually be washed off and run off into our water supplies. And it can actually have, some detrimental effects on not just us, but other organisms within the ecosystems. One really important organism that's being impacted by the pesticides and the chemicals that we spray on our crops are bees and other pollinators. Their populations are being seriously impacted by the use of those chemicals. Another very famous example is DDT. DDT was sprayed on crops, and then it worked its way up the food chain where it was basically killing off all of our bald eagles. So we had a really steep decline in the bald eagles, which is our national symbol, national bird. And a really famous book by the name of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was written to address this problem. After the release of this book, it made lawmakers actually aware of the issue. DDT was banned, and now we're seeing resurgence of our bald eagle populations. Atrazine's another chemical that was used that impacted both amphibian and fish populations. And so that's now been banned, and we're starting to see a rebound with some of those populations as well. Our 5.3 practice FRQ. Describe one environmental advantage and one environmental disadvantage of using genetically modified crops. Okay, our next topic is going to be the impact of agricultural practices. I'll see you guys in class soon. Bye.